So it gives me great pleasure to talk today to you guys about percutaneous left atrial appendage closure devices. This is a relatively new topic. It's only a few years old. And I think it's something that's really going to grow in cardiology. So having a good understanding of who are the patients we're doing this in, how we perform the procedure, and what are some of the indications and contraindications, I think is going to be important for all cardiologists and everyone that manages patients with atrial fibrillation. So you guys know the epidemiology of atrial fibrillation. Lifetime risk is 1 in 4, so 25% of us are going to have atrial fibrillation. And again, we're all very aware of the risk factors: family history, hypertension, other cardiac disease, and most importantly, age. Atrial fibrillation is a disease of the elderly, and your risk increases with age. Atrial fibrillation of itself isn't really a problem. However, patients with atrial fibrillation on average have a 5-fold increased risk of stroke lifetime. And what's really interesting is when you look at patients with atrial fibrillation, 90% of the strokes that they experience are thought to be cardioembolic. So if you take all patients with atrial fibrillation that come in with a stroke and you do a TE on them, 90% of them will have left atrial thrombus. And moreover, the strokes that are caused by atrial fibrillation tend to be much more severe than ischemic strokes. These are large clots, and so they tend to block larger blood vessels, and the morbidity associated with stroke secondary to atrial fibrillation is quite high. So Dan gave us a wonderful review on rhythm versus rate control, and we're all very familiar with augmenting therapy to reduce thromboembolic risk in patients with atrial fibrillation. You can start with antiplatelets, move to vitamin K antagonists. Most recently, we've added NOACs to our armamentarium, and I'm going to talk to you guys today about left atrial appendage occlusion. So anticoagulation is very effective at reducing the risk of stroke, but it's not without its risk of complications. In unrestricted populations, so if you take all comers that you treat with an anticoagulant for atrial fibrillation, the rate of major bleeding per year is 2 to 13%, depending on your risk profile. So not an insignificant risk. There are risk scores available to us to help us risk stratify which patients are at highest risk of this complication. However, they are cumbersome and rarely do we use them clinically. What we often see, what is a common clinical scenario that we face, is when we have a patient who has a good indication for anticoagulation, but we feel that the patient factors prevent its use. Large randomized control trials show that you do get a 67% relative risk reduction using an oral anticoagulant versus placebo, and 33% versus antiplatelets. So this is something that's very beneficial to the patients. However, when you look at patients out there in the real world with atrial fibrillation, only about a quarter of patients with atrial fibrillation actually get put on an oral anticoagulant. So despite the overwhelming benefit and the lion's share of data supporting its use, we don't use it, even though 70% of the patients are eligible for oral anticoagulants based on trial data. So out in the real world, most patients with atrial fibrillation are in fact not being treated to reduce their thromboembolic risk. And that's because although the drug companies would like you to think atrial fibrillation looks like this, more often than not, atrial fibrillation looks like this. And that's because atrial fibrillation, as I said, is a disease of the elderly, and our patients with atrial fibrillation are often frail, have several comorbidities, and thus are at increased risk of bleeding complications. And this makes the general internists, the family doctors, and sometimes the cardiologists unwilling to put patients on an oral anticoagulant. So the left atrial appendage is a 2 to 4 centimeter tubular structure attached to the left atrium. And it's often referred to as the most lethal appendix. And that's because of the risk of stroke associated with atrial fibrillation and the morbidity associated with it. What's interesting is even though we thought that 90% of the 90% of the strokes in patients with atrial fibrillation come from the left atrial appendage, early trials of occlusion or exclusion of the left atrial appendage have met with mixed success. And that's because the early trials were actually attempted surgically. So surgeons were in there doing other work on the heart and thought, I'll just clip off the left atrial appendage while I'm there. And what we've learned over time is that suturing the left atrial appendage or stapling the left atrial appendage externally doesn't provide protection from risk of thromboembolic events. And that's because you're often left with eddies there. They often create an irregular surface of the left atrial appendage, and it still remains a nidus for thrombus. And so what some very innovative people have done is thought, well, why don't we try closing this from the inside? And there's a number of ways that this is done. This is a Watchman device made by Boston Scientific. This is an amulet device made by St. Jude Medical. These two devices are rarely used. This is actually a lariat device where you lasso off the left atrial appendage from the outside, from the pericardial space. And so what they've designed is scaffolds that live inside the left atrial appendage, and actually, much like an ASD occluder or a PFO occluder, provide a scaffold for the body to heal naturally over top of the device, as opposed to simply closing off the ostium. And there's a number of devices that are being developed, but there's really two strategies to closing the left atrial appendage. This is a Watchman device, and so to do the procedure, it's a venous procedure, so we come up through the vein and we do a transeptal. So obviously patients have to have venous access, so patients that have filters in their IVC for DVTs are obviously ineligible. We have to be able to do a transeptal, and then we bring our sheaths out into the left atrial appendage, so patients can't have left atrial thrombus. That's obviously a contraindication of the procedure. Then what we do, the first strategy is kind of a football strategy. You're putting a dome inside of the left atrial appendage. There are actual barbs on the nitinol frame, so as the device expands, it provides radial force on the left atrial appendage, and the hooks prevent it from moving into the left atrium. And then this dome lives in the os, and the idea is that your body heals over top of this dome, eventually sealing it off. The second approach is actually an anchoring device and a disc. So this is the amulet device. And so this device actually has a lobe, which will sit more distally in the left atrial appendage. This provides all the anchoring force for the device. And so we measure the size of the left atrial appendage. We oversize the nitinol frame. This also has hooks to prevent it from moving into the left atrium. Once that's secured, we pull on it to make sure it's anchored. And we simply release a device with a lobe that's bigger than the os, and that gets pulled in against it, sealing off the ostium. And so that's the two strategies of devices that have been deployed, and each of them have their advantages depending on the anatomy of the patient. And as I alluded to, the idea of these devices is not that they're occlusive the second we deploy them. They're not. These are porous materials. But the idea is that what you provide is a scaffold for the tissue to grow over top of it, leading to exclusion of the left atrial appendage. So you can see a canine model here at 30 days. This is by 45 days. The device is healed over. And this is a human pathology specimen of a Watchman device. And you can see the tissue has grown nicely over top, excluding the left atrial appendage from communicating with the left atrium. So what's the data supporting this? It's an invasive procedure. It's not without cost and risk. And the data supporting the use of left atrial appendage closure is actually pretty solid. So this is the PROTECT AF trial. This is the first trial that was done looking at the use of the Watchman device. It was published in 2009, so this is already very old data. It was 3 years, this is 3 years of follow-up, so this data was done in 2005, 2006. And what they did, and this is what we practice here, what you do is these patients were randomized to Coumadin, or what was done is they were on Coumadin for 45 days, and then they took an antiplatelet agent after 45 days if successful occlusion was done. And so what we do with our patients is we get a baseline CT scan, a baseline transesophageal echocardiogram, we deploy the device, we repeat their imaging at 45 days to 90 days, depending on when we can get them back, to assess whether or not we've successfully occluded it. You always get little bits of leaks around the devices, and that's okay. There's good data to support as long as those leaks are minimal in size, the risk of stroke is negligible. And then in this trial, patients discontinued their Coumadin if they had successful occlusion and took Plavix out to 180 days. Now these trials, all of these trials are of a very different design. They're not of the type of trials that we're used to seeing. They're Bayesian analysis. And so what you actually get is you get a probability of being non-inferior and a probability of being superior based on known event rates in the population that was studied. So you have to know what the event rates are to calculate your sample size. And that's just because as you can imagine, doing device trials like NOAC trials isn't the same thing. We can't enroll 10,000 patients. We're really lucky if we can get 400. And so the statistics are a little bit different. But what they found is the primary efficacy, so that's ischemic stroke, cardiovascular unexplained death, hemorrhagic stroke, and systemic embolism, was greater than 99% certainty non-inferior to Coumadin. So it was as good as Coumadin at reducing your risk of these bad things happen. And there was a 90% probability that it was superior, although it didn't meet the criteria for significance at that point. And the primary safety endpoint, there were more events in the device arm, and that's because these are the first people in the world implanting this device, and there were some procedural related strokes as they learned to do the procedure. Subsequently, they've published the 4-year follow-up data. So this is the exact same trial, and this was published in JAMA. And so as you can imagine, the benefit of this device is not up front. This is like all trials where you do an intervention. you take all of your risk up front and you get all of your benefit down the road. So the further this goes out, the better and better Watchman's going to look because you've taken patients off of Coumadin. And so what they were able to show, again, the primary efficacy, definitely non-inferior, and had met superiority criteria. So the Watchman device was superior to Coumadin at reducing the risk of stroke, as well as systemic embolization and cardiovascular or unexplained death. And again, this is just a graphical representation of this. You pay up front for your device, and then over time, your primary efficacy, you continue to accumulate events in the Coumadin arm. Most of these are intracerebral bleeds or major bleeding events, excuse me, and where you tend to level off in the device arm. Now in Canada, neither of these devices are approved, so we have access to them through the Special Access Program. And currently, we're only doing patients who are oral anticoagulant ineligible. And so there's limited data and no randomized data in this cohort. So what the device companies have done is they've looked at their series of patients that are anticoagulation ineligible. And this was published back in JACC in 2013. It's called the ASAP trial. And so they looked at what happens if you use these devices in patients who aren't eligible for an oral anticoagulant. As you can remember, in the device arm, patients still got 45 days of anticoagulation after the device was implanted. And they wanted to demonstrate that it was safe to implant the device in patients who weren't able to take an oral anticoagulant. And what they were able to do is compare the primary efficacy endpoint versus what was expected based on their CHAD score, and they got a significant reduction in the risk of stroke relative to what they would have expected if these patients were just treated with dual antiplatelet therapy. It's not great research, but it's the research that we have in this cohort because it's been deemed unethical to randomize patients who are ineligible for oral anticoagulation. And unfortunately, there are no clinical trials planned in this cohort because the device companies feel that they're going to be treating these patients anyways, and they feel that physicians won't be willing to randomize patients to a placebo arm or control arm versus device closure. Now, after those first two trials, this is actually an FDA-mandated trial. So given the overwhelmingly positive data of PROTECT AF, they actually asked them to repeat the trial using the device to see if it was still positive. And again, the design was very similar. Basically, patients still got oral anticoagulation or oral anticoagulation for 45 days, followed by antiplatelet agents out to 180 days or 6 months, and then they were free to be on aspirin monotherapy alone. And again, very different looking statistics. But what they actually what they were not able to show in this trial was a non-inferiority. So compared to Coumadin, they did not meet criteria. They were very, very close, but they were not able to demonstrate non-inferiority relative to Coumadin therapy. And that's because the event rate in the Coumadin arm was exceedingly low. So the event rate in the Coumadin arm was a third of that seen in the NOAC trials. And so unfortunately, because the event rate was so low based on patient selection, they didn't meet their pre-specified statistical endpoint. That being said, if once you excluded device-related or deployment-related issues, the device did provide protection supporting the hypothesis, and the complication rate was exceedingly low because these implanters had now done a lot of implants. And so as people became experienced with the device, they had less complications. Based on this data, the FDA approved the Watchman device in the United States, and the indication is CHADS1 and eligible for an oral anticoagulant, so everybody. And that's actually how the device has been approved in the United States. It's unclear how Health Canada is going to evaluate this device. I suspect it will, at a minimum, be approved for use in patients who are ineligible for oral anticoagulation. If they look at the data, and certainly the meta-analysis, including PREVAIL and PROTECT AF, is overwhelmingly positive, I suspect they'll approve it as an alternative to Coumadin in patients who are CHADS1 and eligible for oral anticoagulation. And certainly this trial, the other really important point I think with this trial is that it demonstrates that this procedure is very safe. And as you gain more experience, the number of device-related or procedural-related adverse events, specifically air embolism, is reduced. And this is the same thing that we saw with MitraClip. As interventional cardiologists become more comfortable using large sheaths, 14 French sheaths in the left atrium, we've become more accustomed to being attuned to our air management, and it's reduced the number of procedural-related adverse events. So what about the other device? All of this data is using the Watchman device. That's that football type device. We've also started using the Amulet device, which is a lobe and disc type device here at the Ottawa Heart Institute. We did 3 of them last week. And again, this was actually published out of Canada. So Dr. Marquis is a collaborator. Reda Abraham was here last week and talked to us about this. And so what they did is very similar to the ASAP study. They looked at the use of the Amplatzer cardiac plug, which is the prequel device to the amulet, in patients who are ineligible for anticoagulation. And that's very similar to the patients that we see here. The most common is neurologic or GI bleeding. That's the most common contraindication. And what they were able to show, same statistical methodology, so what would be expected and what was observed. So the rate of stroke was significantly lower in the patients that received the device than would have been expected based on their CHADS risk score. Number of thromboembolic events and the event rate of major bleeding also much lower. And so all of this data supports use of this device in this patient population. Again, no randomized data available, best available data. So here at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, what kind of patients are we doing? Right now, we're doing Coumadin ineligible or NOAC ineligible patients using the Special Access Program. Obviously, the patients should have an indication for oral anticoagulation, and we get it through the Special Access Program. To date, we've implanted 25 Watchman devices. We've implanted 6 amulet devices, and I keep a database on them, and I can tell you we've had no stroke or thromboembolic events after the device has been implanted. We've had 1 device embolization during implantation, which was retrieved percutaneously. So no adverse event related to that embolization. And so the device is performing very well in the patients that we've implanted it in. In particular, I can tell you, we've had a couple of patients that have had numerous strokes off of oral anticoagulation that we've implanted, and they've had no strokes in follow-up. And so the device performance has been very good. And so in summary, left atrial appendage occlusion is a good alternative based on the data that's available for thromboembolism prophylaxis in OAC ineligible patients. It's probably a good alternative in patients who are eligible for oral anticoagulation. Unfortunately, I think the data that we're going to get on these devices is going to be limited moving forward. Boston Scientific has FDA approval for CHADS-1 versus Coumadin. There's very little reason for device companies to invest in further data. So I think this is going to be one area in medicine where we're going to be left with a little bit of a knowledge gap. To do trials to show non-inferiority to NOACs are going to be too large and cost prohibitive to perform. And so what I think we're going to see moving forward, especially depending on how Health Canada approves this device, is we're going to have a discussion with our patients about what their preference is moving forward, to continue with an oral anticoagulant or to consider device closure. What's also particularly fascinating, I think it speaks to the times we're living in, I've had several patients who have been referred, who have been targeted on Facebook. Because the program is approved in the United States, they will actually get ads in their Facebook telling them to come down to the United States and they'll close their left atrial appendage for $25,000. So I think it's fascinating that the companies and the laboratories are already targeting patients to come down and have that procedure done in the United States. It is important to recognize the contraindications to the procedure. So obviously we have to work in the left atrium. So left atrial appendage thrombus is a contraindication. There's an asterisk on that. In patients who have a left atrial appendage thrombus, have had recurrent events, and are truly ineligible for anticoagulation, we can close the left atrial appendage, and it has been done. But you want to make sure that that indication is good. So they must have had recurrent thromboembolic events and be truly anticoagulation ineligible for us to take that. And that's a risk-benefit discussion you have to have with your patient. We need to have vascular access. Obviously, it's a transvenous procedure and a transseptal puncture. So patients who have devices in their interatrial septum are ineligible. Patients in whom we're unable to get up through the through the venous system will be unable to do this procedure in. And then an inability to take antiplatelet agents is a theoretical contraindication. So patients are supposed to be able to take dual antiplatelet therapy once the device has been implanted. I can tell you we've implanted some patients who are unable to take even aspirin, and those patients have had no events. There is a theoretical risk of forming thrombus on the face of the device after it's been implanted. We haven't observed that here in Ottawa. It is reported in the literature. So in patients, again, who the indication is good, they've had recurrent events, they're truly ineligible to take antiplatelets, certainly we'll discuss the risk-benefit profile of that procedure with them. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.